First year my kids haven't done it. So like my kindergarten, we used to only kindergarten actually. So we're supposed to wait. Maybe next year they can all do it together. Yeah, I don't remember that. Wow. Yes, well that's.
You can appreciate that as well. How are you doing? Good. What grade are you doing? Take the test. What grade are you in? 12. Oh, all right. Where are you going to go to school next year? You know? Oh, right. Oh, good. Okay. 2 minutes.
Did you figure out or still have to do some training?
What?
Did you figure out?
I eventually did.
$7,700. Yeah, we'll be here tomorrow for the kids. Yeah, like for tomorrow, we can just leave it like this and we'll be out of here.
You guys hear this? This is going to be epic. There's like 5 people here. Hmm.
So after this first tomorrow too, and then we'll be out by 11:30. Yep. Yeah, they were great. No, we're good. I guess let's just get a live stream. Hey.
Yeah. Right, do it once. That's exactly right.
Are you doing well?
Do you have a favorite puppy that you?
What are you doing for Christmas?
Oh, okay, yeah, okay.
We're going to.
Oh, okay, that's not. Oh, okay. You have relatives there? Oh, really? You go down Christmas Day? So that's your dance? That's your
Yeah, I was like, he was like, and he said that's where he's going, I was like, yeah.
What's the name of the other place?
Korea, right?
I want to say, it's Korea. And I want to say.
Yeah, and they did say they can absolutely, first of all, like, not hard to understand. Oh, LaCroix? Yeah.
Oh, sure, oh, certainly. Yeah, because a good friend of mine is, he's an I thought that she was like this. And that's it. That's it. You have this stuff. And that's by the end of 4 years.
Anybody else that was here? And then let's, where did we go? He did, he went to go tell the girls. Yeah, you went to tell the girls.
Yes, I'm just like.
Let's get ready to see here, huh?
A little bit.
Yeah, like, but.
But I have to think of this. really anticipating that something's going
More
to.
vested. That's right.
We're the ones who show up.
That's right.
So it's really nice that you were able to make it.
I'm ready. All right.
Yeah. You want it to be-
You told you I'll come back.
Did we go on town?
They apologize, but they'll go.
Right, exactly. That's.
This isn't a huge crowd, so I think they'll handle.
Whatever. Oh, yeah, more than anything. Or not, okay.
So my brother-in-law.
Whoa, okay. Oh, that's amazing.
So you have away.
All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. Welcome to St. Mary Parish. On behalf of St. Mary Homeschoolers, we are very excited to welcome Mr. Philip Campbell this evening. Mr. Philip Campbell is a history teacher for Homeschool Connections, and that's how we got to know him. He's probably their most popular teacher. For those of you whose kids have taken classes through him, they know that he combines humor and along with a love and passion for history. He's also a prolific author of various historical works, most known for the Story of Civilization series from Tan Books. He received a BA in history from Ave Maria University and a certificate in secondary education from Madonna University. He travels around the United States and Canada promoting historical literacy and has appeared on EWTN, Ave Maria Radio, the Catholic Faith Network, and numerous other programs and podcasts to share his love of history. Philip comes from Southern Michigan and is a homeschool father of 5, and his favorite dinosaur is a Stegosaurus.
Thank you. That was nice.
You wrote it, so.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for putting this together, Ellen. This came together really nicely. And thank you, Father, for hosting at this parish. My name is Mr. Philip Campbell. I'm very glad to be here to talk to you about challenges and strategies teaching modern history. And when Ellen first talked to me about this and was thinking about what should I talk about, there was so much stuff going on in the world, and people were like hitting me up constantly, asking me kind of like, what am I supposed to think about what else is going on? And I started thinking, there's a lot about modern history that we don't understand. We tend to have gaps in our knowledge of what's going on in the world in recent times. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, some challenges that we face when we're teaching modern history, which for the purpose of this talk, I'm defining really as history from like early 20th century on, like World War I up to today. And it gets more harder as it goes. Before we start, I just want to mention I have a big table full of my books back there. I'll be at the table afterwards. I don't have any cash to give you back, so it's check or card or whatever you give me as a donation, because I can't give change. Speaking of donations, I have a free will offering basket there. There's no ticket price to get in here. What I'm getting compensated is what you buy off the table or what you put in my basket, and this is my full-time livelihood. Many authors and homeschool teachers, homeschool connections, it's kind of like a part-time thing. For me, this is all I do. As you heard in Ellen's introduction, I pretty much live and breathe this 24 hours a day. I travel all over the place. I just promote the study of history and historical knowledge and education to Catholic homeschoolers. So when you're considering what you can give, you wealthy Catholic homeschoolers, I pray that you will be generous. So I actually started to notice a problem with modern history way back when I was still a student, even in high school. And many of you might have had this experience as well. I'd be using a textbook, usually a US history textbook, and sometimes European history, mainly US history, and I'd be working my way through the text. I'd get to the end, and I'd notice that I'd run out of book before we ran out of history. You ever looked at like a US history textbook and it ends at World War II? Or it just kind of stops, or sometimes even World War I, it just stops in the middle of the 20th century. I've seen this so many times in Catholic books and secular books. I started to think there must be something to it. Now, sometimes the book is just old. When I was in public school in the 80s, I'd open the book and at the front it'd be like, our president, Gerald Ford, and it was like, okay, it's just an old book, but usually it's more than that. Usually there's an editorial decision that we're only going to go so far up to the present and then no further. Like there's a hesitation to tackle events that are too recent, that are too fresh. Now, many homeschool parents exhibit the same hesitancy to really dive into modern history. They're much more comfortable talking about the Battle of Gettysburg than the Battle of Fallujah. They're way more comfortable talking about the Persian War with the Greeks than they are talking about the Vietnam War, more comfortable talking about Pericles than Gorbachev. So there seems to be like this implicit reluctance to take it on, at least with the same gusto that we dive into like, oh, the medieval history, that's fun. The ancient history, that stuff's fun. And then you get into the modern, you're like, oh gosh, I don't want to go through that. Or even earlier stages of US history even, we're very excited to, talk about the Civil War is fun and Revolutionary era, it's all great stuff. And then you get up to like, oh, I gotta talk about like the Carter years or something. We don't want to do that. So the result with this is that I've noticed as a teacher that there's a gap in students' knowledge of modern history. And if this gap is unaddressed, it follows them into adulthood, as it likely followed many of you, and as it followed me for many years. Now, this leaves us ultimately with adults who don't understand the modern world. They don't understand what's going on in the world, and they don't understand why. And they aren't educated enough to make independent decisions about the things that they are witnessing. Now, considered from a civics perspective, this makes one especially vulnerable to political demagoguery, right? Clickbait influencers, fake news. So if you don't understand, for example, like almost a year ago now when the Russian-Ukraine war broke out, if you don't understand like the context for that or the background, you are much more likely to just shape your opinions and your votes based on whatever the talking head on whatever network you watch tells you. So beyond just the personal growth aspect of this, that we just should be educated as adults in the world, there's a real danger from a social perspective that we're turning out citizens who are fundamentally just uneducated about the historical issues that underlie all our current problems. So in this talk, there's going to be two parts of the talk. First, I'm going to offer some thoughts on why we treat modern history this way. And then in the second part, I will posit some strategies for redressing this deficiency. So first, challenges. Why is there a hesitancy to deal with modern history? First point, this is very basic. We ourselves don't know it. We ourselves don't know it. In a homeschooling setting, I think the number one reason why we slack on modern history is because we're not that familiar with it. We don't know how to explain it, and we can't pass on what we don't know. It's kind of, let me silence my notifications, sorry. It's kind of like when your student's like, hey, I'm having trouble with this calculus, and you're like, I don't know, I can't help you, Same thing with modern history. We ourselves often haven't been exposed to it. So we grow up with a modern history gap, and that just kind of causes us to pass it on because we don't feel comfortable guiding our children through something that we ourselves don't understand. That's number one. Number two, and this is what I call a structural problem, is that we don't have time to teach modern history. Now you're going to say, what do you mean? I devote we have a year, that we go through this stuff. You think you do, but you actually don't. There's a popular historical template for homeschooling high school history that breaks history up into a 4-year cycle. Now this applies to high school mainly. So what I'm going to say applies to high school because middle school is typically like 3 years, right, usually. But you will find variations of this cycle in middle school and even elementary school. So the template for high school history goes something like this. Year 1, ancient. Year 2, medieval. Year 3, modern European. And year 4, US history. Okay? Anybody ever use something like that? Or use that to structure your template for how you're doing education? It's very, very common. Some of you probably, many of you probably use this. And there's nothing wrong with that structure, especially for middle school or younger grades. It's time tested. My Own Story of Civilization textbooks, which are for elementary and lower middle school, they use that 4-year cycle. And so when kids are at that age, I think that's a great cycle because kids that age don't need as much detail. They don't need to understand all the geopolitics and whatever. They just need the gist of it and some fun stories, and that's great. But I do think that we should give thought to this structure when it comes to high school because, as I will show you, it doesn't accommodate modern history very well. So year 1 and year 2 are fine. You can get a solid education in ancient and medieval in 2 years. The problem is that year 4 jacks everything up. Year 4 is US history. Now, this is the only year where we're devoting an entire year to the history of a single country, and that makes sense because it's our country, and depending on what state you live in, many states mandate that you have to spend a year studying this specific subject. So it's pretty much a given that you're going to spend a year on US history no matter what. Now, you've spent 1 year in ancient, 1 year medieval, 1 year US. That means everything else in the world from the end of the Middle Ages to today needs to be stuffed into year number 3, okay? Now, most of your medieval study lessons are going to end around the Renaissance. So modern European history, year 3, is typically going to start at the Reformation and then go forward from there. Now, let's think about everything that needs to be covered then in that year. I've got a bullet point list right here. The Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the age of the religious wars, the age of exploration, the discovery of the New World, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the age of European liberalism, colonialism, imperialism, the unification of Germany, the unification of Italy, World War I, the Russian Revolution, the rise of communism, the rise of fascism and National Socialism, World War II, the Cold War, the nuclear age, decolonization, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany, maybe the wars in the Balkans, if you want to get into that, the creation of the EU, and the global war on terror. Okay, so you don't have time to do that, right? You do not have time. So this leaves you with a really strange situation where Martin Luther is in the same unit as Osama bin Laden, okay? Very odd. Now, of course, that's only if we're focusing on European history, right? So we're not even taking into account if you want to follow a more global approach, which would require even more content, and this doesn't take into account any specifically Catholic content. So let's say you want to add learning about modern saints, the Second Vatican Council, the end of the Papal States, the pontificate of John Paul II. You want to add all that stuff in too, then you got even less time, okay? So there's simply not enough time to cover that material on the 4-year cycle. 99% of the time, you will not get through it all, at least if you're hoping to go at a reasonable pace. I used to teach middle school at a co-op in Ann Arbor, Michigan, middle school history, and the high school history teacher would be trying to get through all this content in a year, and I'd always look at him, and I would think he's never going to make it. He'd always try, and he'd go, oh, no, this year I'm going to stay on the task, you know. He thought it was a problem with him not going fast enough, and he didn't realize it was kind of like a structural problem. I was like, you're never going to be. He never did, never made it, not once. What would happen was he would get to Napoleon Bonaparte by April. Napoleon by April. Was Napoleon even on my list? Did I say Napoleon? Yeah. Oh, good, okay. He would get to Napoleon by April, and then he'd be rushing to cover 2 centuries in the weeks after Easter break, and then I don't think he ever made it to 1900 by the end of the semester, let alone up to, 20, whatever. So you might have experienced something like this where you're just rushing at the end of that year. So this is why the 4-year cycle just doesn't give enough time to get educated about this. And what's going to happen is you're going to start strong. You're going to be like Renaissance, Reformation, blah, blah. And then when you get to like the 1800s, you're just going to you're going to be like, oh, it's May, and then that's it. And you're like, oh, I guess we're not going to learn about, then World War II happened, and then that's going to be about it, right? So there's too much content to cover. And even if you could cover it in a year, it doesn't really go together thematically. Like I said, like Martin Luther and the Reformation doesn't belong in the same semester with Osama bin Laden. They're like thematically, they shouldn't even be together. So you don't have time. That's the second reason why people go on with this gap in knowledge. Number 3, modern history is complicated. Ugh, this is a big deal here. At least relative to earlier historical periods, right? I mean, any history can be complicated. Let's do a little experiment. What was, and you can just blurt it out. What was the purpose of the Crusades? Bingo, she said it in 2 seconds. Get back the Holy Land, right? That's, does anybody have a different answer? Okay. Get back the Holy Land. Okay, what was the big issue that precipitated the Civil War? Slavery, very good, okay. Okay, now watch what happens when we go into modern times. What caused World War I? The shooting of Franz Ferdinand caused the war? That was like the little thing that kicked it off. You know, there's a lot less like certainty. We're like, well, it had something to do with that guy that got shot. Somehow, and then somehow 32 nations went to war over it. This guy got shot, and then like 30 countries were like, "War, it's on!" Why? What? Okay. Why did we get involved? Okay, what caused the energy crisis of the 1970s? Why did we fight the Persian Gulf War? To get Saddam out of Kuwait, but why did we care about what was going on in Kuwait? Okay, so see, the answers aren't that forthcoming. Now, it's not that we don't know or can't explain. I'm sure that with many of you, if I sat down at a table and we got some notes out or something, we talked about this for a while, we could probably hash it out and understand what the Persian Gulf War was about. But the thing is, it's not the sort of stuff that's just like, oh, get back to Holy Land. I know it. I understand it just intuitively, right? It doesn't scale to a younger, and it doesn't scale to a younger audience as easily. So let's do another, Luke, come up here. Okay, so the Civil War was, I know there's lots of different things that led up to it, but the major issue. Okay, why did American colonists want to rebel against Great Britain? What were they ticked about? Okay, no, but taxes. Yeah, taxes. Okay. Why did the United States get involved in the Vietnam War in the 60s? Did you see that facial expression? No? Okay. Well, I'm gonna explain it to you. Okay, I'm gonna explain the Vietnam War here. So with the collapse of the French colonial ambitions in the Vietnam Peninsula following the 1954 Viet Minh uprising, the peninsula was separated into two separate countries, a communist north and a democratic free south. But see, the communists wanted to unite that entire peninsula, so they invaded the south to take over the whole thing and bring it under the Hanoi administration. But the United States, per the containment doctrine that we had committed ourselves to under the presidency of Harry Truman, stated that we could not tolerate the expansion of communism into regions where it wasn't already present, and therefore we were resolved to stop the spread of communism into the southern part of the Vietnamese peninsula. So we were going to oppose that, but the problem is that North Vietnam was an ally of both communist China and Soviet Russia, which were much bigger countries, and we didn't want to provoke them into possibly getting involved in the region too. So our assistance to South Vietnam had to take the form of technical assistance, military advisement, and that was all we did. But that changed in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, when American naval vessels were attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, which led to something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution that authorized President Lyndon Johnson to have war powers in the Vietnamese peninsula, but without actually waging war against any particular country. So from 1964 on, we start to actually take on combat roles, not only against the North Vietnamese army, but also against the Viet Cong guerrillas who were operative in the south, but also in Cambodia and Laos. And this was ultimately about propping up the South Vietnamese puppet state, which really amounted to a proxy war against the broader communist powers in East Asia. So that's what was going on.
More than I knew before.
Cool. All right. Vietnam War simplified for Luke Winnie. Okay, so now I probably could have made that a little bit simpler, you know. But the point is, when we get into modern history, you run into stuff like that, where you're like, how do I explain this to my 12-year-old, you know? And there's ways we can do that. But the point is, when we get to that modern history, like the point 3 here, modern history is complicated, right? Even if we understand it, we might struggle to find age-appropriate ways to teach it to our kids. And even if we do that, finding solid books and resources adds a whole nother layer of difficulty. So that's the third one. Modern history is complicated. Number 4, modern history is less personal. Now, the defining characteristic of modern history is that, at least in the West, it's the transition away from monarchy towards democracy. And this is a process that begins with the American and French revolutions of the 1770s and 80s, and then kind of tips decisively in favor of democracy after World War I. Now, democracy signifies the rule of the people, right, instead of by monarchs or nobles. And thus, as we move further into the modern period, less decisive action is attributed to kings and nobles and more to parliaments, congresses, ministries, mass movements, etc. So not to be sure, there's always personal stories behind these movements, of course, but we lose the ability to structure our history simply around the personal stories of individuals. We can no longer say, King Edward III started the 100 Years' War because he wanted to be king of France. That's such a nice, tidy little statement. But we move into modern history, oftentimes we lose the ability to say things like that. Instead, we have to say things like, prolonged treaty violations by fishermen along the coast of Nova Scotia prompted a diplomatic crisis between Canada and the US, resulting in a flurry of legislation from both the Canadian Parliament and the American Congress. Nobody's going to be teaching about the dispute of fishing rights in Nova Scotia. But my point is, it's an example of how when you get to the modern age, the agency is no longer being carried out by individual people. It's more by bodies, collectives, parliaments, political parties, things like that. We can no longer say something as easy as Henry IV came down to Rome and drove out Pope Gregory. That's great. Instead, we have to say things like, the German Christian Democratic Union formed a coalition government with the Social Democratic Party to push a centrist platform and ensure parliamentary majority over the Free Democratic Party. That's true, by the way. So things can become more anonymized, abstract, and less personal. And this can make it challenging to find the narrative arc in modern events. Now, I've always advocated teaching history as a story. That's what Story of Civilization is predicated on. But stories have to have protagonists with discernible protagonists. It gets harder to latch on to a specific thread of action that constitutes the historical narrative. I'll talk in the second part, I'll talk about what we can do about that, but it's just something to identify. I notice it when I read modern history that it becomes much more anonymized and abstract. Number 5, this is a big one. I was talking about this with Ellen before. The talk is we ourselves are not sure what to make of the events of modern history. That is, we have opinions about it because we lived through it, or people we know lived through it, and we have strong feelings about some of these events. So modern history is modern precisely because we're still living with the ramifications of it in various ways. We wrestle with the economic and political fallout of things for years. Perhaps our parents or relatives were involved in historical events or impacted by them. We may have deeply ingrained views based on our own upbringing, based on our family's political leanings. In other words, in modern history, there's a sense that over and above the facts, we're supposed to have a take on it, right? We're supposed to have like an opinion about some of these things. And we know that other people have different takes on it, different opinions. Consider like the current conflict going on in between Israel and the Palestinians right now, or something like the Brexit vote a few years ago, right? There's a maelstrom of opinions about these events, and many of these opinions are colored by political bias, ethnic bias, personal bias, or just strong feelings because you might have lived through something. This makes it difficult to talk about these subjects. Ellen and I were talking about 9/11 earlier, and she was saying, sometimes when I'm trying to talk about this to my kids, I get choked up, you know? That happens to me sometimes when I talk about it. It makes it hard because you have a very visceral reaction to some of these events. And it can make it very difficult to discuss because we're not sure what take to offer our kids. We're not sure if sometimes we're not sure if the facts we know are political narrative. Like there's been things that I know where I'm like, well, this is what I've heard, but is that really like the truth? Like would the other side have a different take on that? You know, I don't know. Sometimes we feel like we need to offer a certain narrative. Like sometimes we want to make sure that when the kid learns about this, that we make sure we get it through like, oh, those are the bad guys or whatever, you know? So then we have all this opinionated, divisive commentary that surrounds modern events. that complicates our attempt to teach them objectively. A Catholic textbook publisher once told me that he intentionally omitted coverage of modern content from his texts because he said the history isn't settled yet. That there was still a debate about what the history means and what we're meant to take away from it. Now, he wasn't just talking about stuff like 5 years ago, he was talking about stuff like since 1973, basically. Like stuff that people still living today remember, you know? So he said it's not settled, and therefore I don't want to include it because, you know, basically his view was we need to let the long rolling centuries roll by and then there'll become a settled consensus where we all agree on what happened and then it'll be easier. I don't take that approach, but that is an approach that's out there. So I think those are some reasons why when we tackle this subject, it just becomes a little bit more difficult to do, especially if we're looking at all of that together, right? So let's go into some strategies then to address this that I think can just make it significantly less intimidating. So all those factors I just recounted lead to what I call a modern history gap, which is the phenomenon of even otherwise historically literate children like Luke having a gap in their knowledge about specific events in modern history. So I think there's some things we can do to rectify this. So I'm going to give you 5 counterpoints to my 5 other points. So number 1, let's get ourselves educated first. We're less likely to take on modern history if we don't understand it. You don't need to dive in head first, you know, or get into anything crazy intensive, right? Just pick up a modern history book or some publication about modern events and start reading about it. Start filling in your gut. Pick up Story of Civilization, Volume 3. It's for 11-year-olds, but whatever. You know, just read it. You know, read Volume 4. You'll get a lot out of it. Watch a documentary once a month. You know, if I was just saying about Vietnam and you're like, oh, I don't know about that, there's an excellent 12-part PBS documentary on Vietnam. I don't know how you can probably find it. I watched it back in the day before everything was on the internet. It was made like back in the late 90s, but it's a really good, solid documentary on it, and it's got all the footage and goes to the politics, the military, and it really puts it in a good, digestible format. Just watch a documentary, you know, now and then, or listen to a history podcast, you know, when you're driving, whatever. It can be very casual. And this can just be an ongoing thing. You don't have to, you know, get it done in a certain period of time. Just make a resolution that every now and then when I'm driving for an hour, I'm going to put on a history podcast. I recently listened to a history podcast. I can't remember what it was called, so don't ask. But I just found some random podcast and I recommended it. It was like this professor talking about the negotiations of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. And it was fascinating. It had all these points that I'd never even heard about. And I was like, wow, this is good. And then I forgot to bookmark it, lost the podcast. I don't know, can't find it. But anyhow, there's great stuff out there. There's great stuff. Number 2, so if you do that, you'll start to get more confidence on these things and you'll start to have a better idea of what's going on, you know. Number 2, rethink your history cycle. I was talking about how frequently we run out of time before we can get to modern because in high school, we end up doing ancient, medieval, modern, US. But of course, 1 year isn't enough to go from the Renaissance to today. You can't get everything from 1500 to today. And it's deceptive because you look at it and you're like, well, I did ancient history in 1 year and that was like 3,000 years. This is only 500 years. It's like, guess what? That 500 years is packed, you know, so you need more time. You really should allocate 5 years to, I'm going to say high school level history. By beginning the high school curriculum in 8th grade, really. This will, and start with ancient. Start with ancient in 8th grade, okay? This will give you 5 years for high school history and give you some breathing room. Ancient is a good place to start because it's very simple. There's a lot of content like, and then Nebuchadnezzar wanted the land and so he took it. Or, then Pharaoh Khufu built a big pyramid. Like there's a lot of good stuff like that. It's a nice transitionary year from going from middle school into more advanced content. Pretty basic, but then in the second semester you get into Greece and Rome, and then that allows you to up the content a bit, move into more complex political ideas. You can study Greek philosophy or Roman politics, and it starts to like get into more complex content. It's really fun stuff. Then you get into freshman year, 9th grade, and you can start the Middle Ages. And then you continue the cycle from there. So I'm going to give you a 5-year cycle semester by semester. So if you're taking notes, I'm going to tell you every year how I would break it down. Okay, 8th grade fall. This is where you're going to do like Mesopotamia, Egypt, Babylon, etc., like your ancient history. 8th grade spring, Greece and Rome. Okay? I have 8th grade classes for Homeschool Connections. All of that. Okay. Okay, so now we're in freshman year. Freshman year fall, early Middle Ages, like 400 to the year 1000. And then freshman year spring, the late Middle Ages. Easy. That's going to be about the year 1000 to 1500. Sophomore year, fall, early modern Europe. That's going to be the Renaissance and the Reformation. And that is so beautiful because it gives you a whole semester to go through just these two eras that don't take up a lot of time chronologically. It's really just like 250 years. But you can do the history, you can look at the theology, you can work in like apologetics, you can look at the Renaissance art, you can do all sorts of things with that time frame. Sophomore year spring, early modern Europe, 1648 to the French Revolution. A lot happens in that little 150-year period. So you use that. So I have a class that covers just that, a whole high school class that covers just that 150 years. Okay, junior year, fall. French Revolution to the modern day. So now you're going to start from 1789 or wherever you left off, and you're just going to go from there up to however far you're going to get, which now that you only have to go like 200 years instead of 500, you got a little bit more breathing room, okay? Junior year in the spring, this is where you're going to start U.S. history, 1492 to 1763. Spend a semester on the colonial history. Senior year fall, U.S. history 1763 to 1865. And then senior year spring, U.S. history 1865 to today. Now look, you'll notice not only does this give more time for European history, but now we have 3 semesters of U.S. history instead of 2. And the third semester is very focused on the modern stuff, 1865 to today. That means you don't have to worry about getting through the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, all blah, blah, blah. You can just start from the end of the Civil War and focus most of that time in the 20th century. That's what we're doing right now in my live Homeschool Connections class. We started 1865. Right now, we're talking about, I don't remember what we're talking about. We're up into like the 80s. Yeah, we're talking about the 80s. So, did you guys hear Henry Kissinger died yesterday? We were talking about Henry Kissinger in my class last week. He was the Secretary of State under President Nixon, was responsible for restoring diplomatic relations with China, considered one of the United States' most important statesmen of the 20th century. So when I taught my class 3 days ago, he was still alive, and I had a picture of him up there, and I was like, this is Henry Kissinger. Believe it or not, kids, he's still alive. He's like 100 or something. And then the next day I click online and it's like, Henry Kissinger dead at 100. And the students were all like, you jinxed him. You jinxed Henry Kissinger. Anyhow, but the point is this, so this gives you enough time to get everything in, and you've got more than enough time to like explore all the fun stuff and to get up to the modern day. Now there's other ways to get this distribution. If you don't want to start the high school history in 8th grade, many homeschool families are adding a 5th year of high school on the end simply because more and more homeschool families, I'm running into kids that are like 15 and a half and they're like, I'm in my senior year, you know, and they're certainly not ready to go to college or something. So the parent will have them do like another year because they're too smart and they graduate too early. So they're like, oh, you're not done. There's the princess in another castle, you know, you gotta go another year. Or what you could do is do a series of summer programs that function as a 5th year when you add them all up cumulatively. You know, so maybe you have 2 or 3 weeks where you do some summer intensive stuff every summer, and then by the time you get through high school, that functionally amounts to like the time of the 5th year. So the bottom line is, if you want to get serious about modern history, you're going to need another year. Now maybe you don't. Maybe you're like, you know, who cares? I'm happy just breezing over it, whatever. I don't know why you're at this talk if that's the point, but you do have the ability to do that. But I'm just saying, if you want to get it all in and do like a good, thorough job of it, you're going to need that extra time, okay? Otherwise, it's just inevitably going to get crowded out, and that's just the way it works. Okay, number 3, find what I call the thematic backdrop. The thematic backdrop. So there's no way to uncomplexify modern history. There's just no way to. The devil's in the details, as they say, but modern history tends to make a lot more sense when you can find the context or the themes that the historical events occur within. So, for example, the causes of World War I are complex. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is like it's like the match that lights the tinder pile, but that's not the actual cause of the war. The causes are very complex, and most people can't explain it. So in order to understand it, we need to understand the bigger themes of what's going on in the world at the time, like the competition between the liberal countries and the autocratic countries, the imperialism, the competition between imperial domains in Africa, the Middle East, all over the world, right? The competition of these colonial empires. We have to understand, what is nationalism? The idea that people of a shared ethnicity should have their own country. If you share an ethnicity, share a language, you should have your own country. That's why that gentleman was shot in Sarajevo. He was shot by a Serbian nationalist group that wanted to break off Serbia from the Austrian Habsburg Empire to form their own little nationalist state, right? So these are like the themes that form, like if you imagine World War I like a play, you got like your backdrop, these are like the themes that the action unfolds against. Or to use an example from American history, I was just, giving Luke the overly complicated explanation of the Vietnam War, but realistically, how do we understand this? This makes more sense if we understand the idea of containment, which was what President Truman said after the Soviets got the nuclear bomb, was he said, we need to make a commitment that we're going to contain communism, like containing an oil slick. You see where they put the booms on the water to like keep the oil slick in a certain area? That's the way the American government viewed communism. It's like a virus that's spreading and it has nuclear weapons, so we need to keep it contained. And this helps us understand why, like, okay, who cares if the North Vietnamese take over South Vietnam? What do I care here in Ohio, Well, the US had committed to a strategy of preventing this from happening anywhere in the world. And in fact, when we failed to contain communism spread into Cuba, Fidel Castro brought Soviet nuclear missiles onto that island, pointed them at the United States. They're only 90 miles away. They could hit anywhere, even as far up as Missouri and Kentucky, right? That's the Cuban Missile Crisis. That almost brought us to the brink of nuclear war, right? So the US was very serious about not letting this be repeated in other places, right? So this big idea of containment of communism forms a backdrop against which the particulars play out. And now when we understand that idea, the actions in Vietnam make more sense and we can understand it. Well, yes, we wanted to keep communism from spreading. Well, who cares if it spread into South Vietnam? Well, here's the issue. We had a policy that we weren't going to let it spread anywhere, because everywhere it did spread, there was a danger they're going to bring in nuclear missiles, they were going to arm these people, we might have nuclear opponents all over the world, and we were committed to preventing that from happening. And therefore, we did care very much about whether some communists overran the southern half of this peninsula. And you still have to go through all the details, you still have to talk about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, but these things make more sense now that you can, have the setting. You know what I mean? So it's much easier once we've learned about the big ideas. So think about it this way, like Romeo and Juliet would make it makes a lot more sense if we understand the themes of family rivalry that form the backdrop of the play. Imagine trying to follow Romeo and Juliet if we didn't understand who the Montagues and Capulets were and what their relationship was to each other. We wouldn't really know what to make of it. So look for the larger historical themes that form the setting, the background, and then the particulars play out against that background, and that helps them to become more explainable. Okay, number 4, find a protagonist. So I discussed how modern history is more abstract in the sense that it's less personal than pre-modern history because of the rise of democracy and mass movements. This does not in any way mean, however, that there aren't narrative arcs that we can tease out to make explaining this easier. Any good story requires a protagonist. And in modern history, the protagonists are often simply countries instead of individuals or parties. So in ancient Roman history, I'd be able to say Octavian did this, and so Anthony did that, right? But when we get to modern history, I have to say Britain did this, so Germany did that. right? The narrative arc is still there. Don't become confused by the fact that it's often collectives that are doing it. You can still treat those as the protagonist in your story. Or the Republicans did this, so the Democrats did this, right? The Democrats were arguing for secession from the Union, the Republicans said this, or right, the radical Republicans wanted to do this, and then the South responded by doing this. So you're still having like a protagonist sort of approach, but you just have to recognize that those protagonists are now often collective bodies. Now, you can't rely on this exclusively. The history is objectively complicated. You do need to go beyond that and get into some details, but seeing it this way can help you find the narrative chain that you can hang all the rest of your content upon when you are trying to understand it. And you're like, oh, I see what's going on. See, Germany was doing that, and then, okay, so Britain did that. Now I see. And then that makes more sense, again, once you get into the little details. I think of it like literally like a narrative chain, and then all the little details and facts, you can like hang it on that chain, and it makes sense where it's going and what it's connecting. And then once you understand the narrative arc, then you can explain it to someone else, right? Makes sense? Cool. So number 5, try to separate fact from commentary. Something I discuss in my talks on historical bias is learning to separate fact from a narrative or commentary. So a fact is simply what happened, and a commentary is what the facts mean, all right? Now, generally, there's going to be a broad consensus on the fact. People are usually surprised by this. People will ask me, how can I protect my child against bad history? And I usually say, most of the time there's an agreement on the facts. The problem is that the facts are blended with a bunch of commentary. You have to like sort it out, right? Most disputes happen in the realm of commentary, not in the realm of fact. So for example, nobody denies that Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. Has it been 2022 or was it 20? Oh yeah, it's been a while, hasn't it? Goodness. So nobody denies that happened. That's a fact, right? Was the invasion justified? Should the United States be involved? Who are the bad guys? Okay, now we're in the realm of commentary, right? Because we're not just looking at what happened, we're trying to figure out what it means and what I should think about what happened, okay? Now, some people believe it's not possible to deliver modern history without commentary, like they despair of just sorting that stuff out because it's so prevalent. And there's a huge like information industry based around pushing commentary continually. Now, or like that, this is why that guy said, I don't put this stuff in my history books because it isn't settled and I just don't want to wade into that. I disagree profoundly. I think just because there might be disagreement on what the events mean, it doesn't mean that we can't teach the events themselves. In these cases, I recommend a just the facts approach. Now, I think about this information very clinically. You're going to imagine you're a doctor you're telling somebody they have cancer. Doctors are trained to deliver news that can be jarring, but they're trained to deliver it in a way to minimize your emotional response, right? They know you're already going to be emotional when you hear something like you have cancer. And so they try to minimize that emotional response by delivering the news in a certain clinical way. In order to get patients to think clearly about their situation and make a reasonable judgment on their options. So if you feel a topic is too charged and you are unsure how to present it, take a very clinical approach to it. Just the facts that are agreed upon, right? If there are divergent takes on it, let's say that what if the facts are disputed? Then teach both views. Say like, these people say this, but these people say that. Teach both views on it, right? And don't try to like, feel like you have to justify one or the other. Just give them the facts, and if there's indeterminate facts, tell them that the facts are indeterminate. Say this is a popular account of what happened, but I'm uncertain if this conforms to reality. We do this in my modern American history class when we talk about the massacre of Wounded Knee, where the 7th U.S. Cavalry shot around 200 Sioux Native Americans in cold blood on the. I guess I should say in cold blood. That's a consensus, but we read there's multiple versions of it. Like if you read the native account, they're like, yeah, we were just here, and the soldiers came in and they tried to take this guy's gun, and it accidentally went off, and they thought we were being fired at, and then they fired at us, and they just killed us. If you read the soldiers' account, they're like, no, they were dancing around, and they were inciting the young to take up arms, and they were gesturing, violently, and we believed that we were about to be attacked, and so we fired on them. And there was evidence that there was a military attack planned. And I don't know, I'm the history guy, I don't know which side is correct or whether the truth is in between the two. So when I teach that event, I simply have to say, this is what the natives say, and this is the account of the US Army. And that's all I can do. I don't have to be like, trying to be like, well, I'm gonna make this side look bad, or, like, the history is just the history. The history doesn't care what you think, you know what I mean? So just tell what happened, and if there's different views, tell the different views, and then tell the child that there's different views. And if you don't even, and if you're confused, just be like, this is all I know about it, and that's that. There was really no justification for going into commentaries. You can have other if your kid's like, what do you think about that, Mom? Then you can let it out, and you'd be like, then you can rage about the pinkos or the damn commies or whatever, whatever thing you're angry about, you can let it out. But if you're trying to just communicate the history, you got to just stick to just the facts, just like the doctor would. I remember when I had heart surgery and the doctor was just like, well, you have a large object in your pericardial chamber. We're going to go in through your back to remove it. Chance of death, 1 in 10,000. Chance of paralyzation, 1 in 100,000. It's just like, that's like just what they're doing, and you're just kind of like processing it. But in a way, the fact that he gives it to you that way helps you to process it, If he was like hysterical, then, like he runs in waving baby. Okay, so you can explain different opinions, but do it dispassionately. Just today, I'm teaching live right now a class on the modern Middle East, just from like World War I to today. And I often have to do that. I often have to be like, this is the Palestinian perspective, this is the Israeli perspective, this is the Iraqi perspective, this is the Iranian perspective. This is why Britain did this, but this is why the Syrians did that. And you just have to do it that way. And this strategy has a whole plethora of benefits. It educates about history. It teaches your student to cognitively separate fact from commentary. It promotes higher level thinking by encouraging them to view from multiple perspectives, and it encourages them to think critically about the implications of current events, and it models sound reasoning to them because they see your ability to calmly examine an otherwise heated issue. So there's so many benefits to handling it this way. I don't know why, I cannot fathom the gentleman's comment that I won't put this stuff in my book because I don't want to wade into it. Like, you don't have to wade into it. You can just give just the facts. Okay, so in conclusion, while I admit that modern history can be complex, intimidating, there's no reason we can't give our kids a solid education in modern events. If we give ourselves breathing space, we give ourselves the time to get it in, if we commit to maybe just doing a bit of learning ourselves to fill in our own gaps, if we learn to tackle the subject matter properly, sort out fact from opinion, which we should do anyways, then we can not only fill in the gaps in knowledge, but we can raise educated, thoughtful citizens who can take on current events and understand them in their proper context, form independent opinions about what's going on. So I want to encourage you to take this away with you. Just think on it, and and maybe try to commit to doing, to digging into this stuff a little more. I think it's very important. Okay, one final word, and I know I'm going to disappoint you here, but we're going to have Q&A after this, and people always ask, the number one question I always get asked is for resources, like to give, like, tell me some podcasts, tell me some books. The answer is I don't know, because, see, here's what I tell you. I create the resources. I create the resources the kids use, but I don't use them myself. I'm the one writing the books for the 12-year-olds, and I don't read the 12-year-old books, so I kind of read the dense boring historical tomes, and then I distill it down into books that you all can use. So I'm not out there reading the stuff that you actually need, I'm writing it. So I don't listen to podcasts, I don't know what's out there. Sometimes I catch something and I try and remember. So I don't have a lot of recommendations for resources, but, and the ones I use, people will ask, well, what do you use? Well, the ones I use, you don't want to read through to your kids. They're like that thick and they're boring, you know? So I can't really recommend much, especially for this period. And also there's not a lot of great stuff for this period, but I do have a book called The Catholic Educator's Guide to Teaching History, where I collaborated with a bunch of moms who are good at tracking this stuff down, that I've worked with on Facebook. And these moms kind of collectively, we all came up with a big list of books and videos for all time periods and various ages. And I have it in the back of my book, The Catholic Educator's Guide to Teaching History. I have a few copies on the table, but if you know, if there's not enough, it's on Amazon. It's like $15. So there's a lot of lists back there, and there's a lot of great advice in that book about how to teach history, whether you're doing it in a co-op setting or in your homeschool, including things like just constructing assignments, how to explain things to them, how to grade papers, very down-to-earth stuff. Yeah, you might find something benefit in there. So that's about it. Thank you. Again, after we'll do Q&A, and I'll be back at the table for a while if anyone wants to talk. And please remember my basket over there. And check me out on Homeschool Connections if you want me to. Oh yeah, last thing, if you want me to teach your kids, I've got live classes, recorded classes. I even do one-on-one tutoring over Zoom. If you want to look into that, so you can, you know, if you want to talk to me about it, I'd be happy to chat. So thank you. To do the Jeb Bush, please clap now. That's a modern historical reference. Please clap. Is there any questions? Paul? Yes. All right.
So when you're talking about modern history, first of all, I'm appalled that the 80s are considered history.
Yeah, you're still recovering from it, right?
Yeah. So like that, and even the Russian-Ukraine, like that's a current event, but you're speaking of it also as history.
Yeah, because so like Ukraine is the historical heart of the original country that is now Russia. The original, before there was Russia, there was the Grand Duchy of Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine, and the Dukes of Kiev would be the ones that would go on to create the country of Russia. So that was, Christianity first came to Russia through that region. The Kingdom of Russia came through that region. It wasn't until later in the 1500s that the power seat moved to Moscow or Muscovy. The Russians have always viewed Ukraine as an integral part of their territory, right, historically. But then when the Soviet Union was founded, Joseph Stalin mistrusted the Ukrainians because of their proximity to the West, because they're right on the border with Poland and the West, and he mistrusted them, and by that time they were a little bit different ethnically, and so Joseph Stalin quite intentionally persecuted the Ukrainians, he created an intentional famine to starve them, or deported millions of them to the interior of the country, which gave the Ukrainians an intense dislike of the Russians, quite understandably. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine as an independent entity broke off and became its own democratic country. It went through several problems. There was dictatorship there, and then they had just not even a decade ago, they had